It started as a normal day, just like any other. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. The streets were quiet, except for the occasional sound of cars passing by. In a small town where everyone knew each other, there was one thing everyone agreed on: no one should adopt that dog. The dog had been at the shelter for months. People whispered about it, saying it was cursed, dangerous, or just plain unlucky. Some claimed it had a wild look in its eyes, something unnatural, something off. Every time someone showed interest, the shelter workers quickly warned them. Not that one, they would say. It's better if he stays here. But then came Daniel. Daniel wasn't the type to listen to rumors. He had always believed that every animal deserved love, no matter what people said. When he first walked into the shelter that evening, he wasn't looking for anything in particular. He just wanted to give a lonely dog a home. As he strolled past the rows of cages, tails wagged and hopeful eyes followed him. Some dogs barked excitedly, others whined softly, desperate for attention. But then, in the farthest corner of the shelter, Daniel saw him. A large black dog sitting completely still, its golden eyes locked onto his. Unlike the others, this one didn't beg for attention, just stared. Something about that look sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Not fear, something else. Curiosity. A strange connection. He wasn't sure. A shelter worker appeared beside him, clearing her throat. "I wouldn't recommend that one," she said quickly. "We've had incidents." "Incidents?" Daniel asked, his brow furrowing. The woman hesitated. Strange things happen around him. People who try to take him home always bring him back. Some say he watches them at night like he's studying them. Others say he disappears and reappears in places he shouldn't be. And then there's she trailed off, shaking her head. "Just trust me, you don't want him." Daniel looked back at the dog. It hadn't moved. Still watching. Still waiting. "Has he ever hurt anyone?" he asked. "No," she admitted, almost reluctantly. "Not physically." But her voice dropped to a whisper. "Some people say they hear him whispering." Daniel almost laughed, but something about the way she said it made his stomach twist. He looked at the dog again. It was still silent, still waiting. He didn't believe in curses. He didn't believe in ghosts. And he definitely didn't believe a dog could whisper. So, despite the warnings, despite the uneasy glances from the shelter staff, Daniel made his decision. "I'll take him." The shelter worker's face went pale. "Are you sure?" Daniel nodded. "I'm sure." She sighed, shaking her head, but didn't argue. "All right," she said, unlocking the cage. As she opened the door, the dog finally moved. It stepped out slowly, stretching its legs, then turned its piercing eyes up to Daniel. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the dog's tail gave a slow, deliberate wag. Daniel reached out, hesitating only for a second, then rested his hand on the dog's head. Its fur was cold, colder than it should have been. That was the first moment Daniel felt it. A strange, unshakable feeling deep in his chest. He had just made a mistake he could never undo. But it was too late. The adoption papers were signed. The shelter doors closed behind them. And as Daniel walked to his car, the dog trotting silently beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, it was the dog who had chosen him. Daniel drove home in silence. The dog sat in the passenger seat, motionless, staring straight ahead. Unlike most dogs, it didn't sniff around or shift excitedly. No tail wagging, no panting, just stillness. The only sign of life was the slow rise and fall of its chest. Daniel glanced at it a few times, unsure of what to say. It felt ridiculous trying to talk to a dog, but something about the quiet made him uneasy. "You need a name," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel. The dog didn't react. He thought for a moment. "How about Shadow?" he suggested, looking at its sleek black fur. Still nothing. No flick of the ears, no tilt of the head. Daniel sighed and focused back on the road. Maybe the dog was just nervous. After all, it had been in the shelter for a long time. He figured it just needed time to adjust. As they pulled into his driveway, the street was unusually empty. His house was a modest one-story place, nothing fancy, but it was home. He parked the car and opened the door. The dog hopped out without hesitation. Didn't sniff around or explore. Instead, it stood perfectly still, waiting. Daniel grabbed the leash and reached down to clip it onto the collar the shelter had given him. But before he could, the dog started walking, straight to his front door. Daniel hesitated. How did it know where to go? It had never been here before. Shaking off the unease, he followed. Unlocking the door, he pushed it open and let the dog step inside first. As soon as they entered, a strange feeling settled over the house. It was subtle, like the air had shifted. Daniel closed the door behind him and sighed. "All right, let's get you settled," he said, turning on the living room light. The warm glow filled the space, making things feel a little more normal. The dog stood in the middle of the room, its golden eyes scanning the space. Then, without warning, it walked straight to the hallway and stopped in front of Daniel's bedroom door. Daniel frowned. "How do you know that's my room?" The dog didn't move, just stood there waiting. Daniel walked over, half expecting the dog to follow him back to the living room. But as he stepped closer, he noticed something. The door was open, just a crack. Had he left it that way? He could have sworn he had closed it that morning. Pushing the thought aside, he nudged the door open the rest of the way and turned on the light. Everything looked normal. His bed, his nightstand, the small desk in the corner. Nothing out of place. He turned back to the dog, who was still watching him. "All right, I don't know what your deal is, but you can't just go wherever you want," Daniel said, pointing toward the living room. The dog didn't move. Daniel exhaled, feeling a strange weight settle in his chest. He tried to remind himself that this was just an animal. Dog. A regular dog. "Come on," he said, walking past it and patting his leg. Finally, the dog turned and followed him. It moved silently, its paws making no sound against the hardwood floor. Daniel grabbed an old blanket and laid it down in the corner of the living room. "This is your spot," he said, patting it. The dog sat down but didn't lie down, just kept staring at him. Daniel sighed. "Suit yourself," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. He grabbed a quick dinner, turned on the TV for some background noise, and tried to relax. But the entire time he could feel it, those golden eyes watching him. He glanced over at the dog a few times, but it never moved, never blinked. By the time midnight rolled around, Daniel couldn't keep his eyes open any longer. He stood up, stretched, and turned off the TV. The house fell into silence. "All right, Shadow, bedtime," he said, suppressing a yawn. The dog didn't move. Daniel hesitated. "You do sleep, right?" he half-joked. No response. He shook his head and walked down the hall to his bedroom. As he climbed into bed, he left the door open just enough to keep an eye on the living room. Shadow was still sitting in the same spot. Daniel watched for a moment longer, then sighed and turned over. Sleep came quickly, exhaustion pulling him under. But in the middle of the night, something woke him up. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a movement. It was a feeling. The kind of feeling that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Slowly he turned over. The living room was dark, but the faint glow from the streetlights outside cast soft shadows through the window. And in the doorway, perfectly still, stood the dog. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Shadow was staring right at him. Not moving. Not blinking. Just watching. Daniel swallowed hard, his heart thudding in his chest. "Shadow," he whispered. The dog didn't respond. He reached for his phone, flicking on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on Shadow's unmoving form. And that's when Daniel realized something. The dog's eyes, they weren't reflecting the light. Every dog's eyes glowed when hit by a light in the dark. It was natural. But Shadow's, nothing. Just deep, endless gold. Daniel's grip tightened on his phone. His pulse pounded in his ears. He sat up slowly, unsure of what to do. Then, as if nothing had happened, Shadow turned around and walked away. No rush. No hesitation. Just left. Daniel exhaled, running a hand down his face. He was too tired for this. It was just a dog. A weird dog, but still just a dog. He lay back down, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. But even as his eyes grew heavy again, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That, somehow, he wasn't alone in his house anymore. The next morning, Daniel woke up feeling like he hadn't slept at all. His body was heavy, his thoughts foggy. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was something deeper, like a weight pressing on his chest. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, and looked toward the doorway. Shadow wasn't there. For a moment, he almost convinced himself that last night had been some half-dream. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe the stress of adopting a new pet was getting to him. But then he stepped out of bed and noticed something strange. His bedroom door. It was wide open. Daniel knew he had left it slightly ajar, just enough to keep an eye on the dog. But now it was open all the way, as if someone had pushed it. He swallowed hard and walked down the hall, his bare feet pressing against the cool wooden floor. The house was silent. Too silent. Normally there were small sounds in the morning. The hum of the fridge, the creak of the old pipes, birds chirping outside. But now nothing. He turned into the living room, half expecting to see Shadow sitting in the same spot from last night. But the dog wasn't there. The blanket he had laid out was untouched. A chill crawled up Daniel's spine. "Shadow," he called out, his voice rough. No response. His heart pounded faster as he checked the kitchen, the bathroom, even the laundry room. Nothing. The front door was still locked, the windows shut. There was no way the dog could have gotten out. But then, as he stepped back into the hallway, he felt something. Presence. Slowly, he turned toward his bedroom. The door was open, just as he had left it. But now, inside the room, sitting perfectly still at the foot of his bed, was Shadow. Daniel exhaled sharply. "How did you?" He stopped himself. It didn't matter. The dog was here now. Shadow's golden eyes locked onto him, unblinking. Daniel shook off the unease and forced a chuckle. "You scared me for a second," he muttered, walking toward the dog. "You gotta stop doing that." He reached out hesitantly and rested a hand on Shadow's head. The fur was cool again, too cool. The dog didn't react. Daniel frowned. "You okay?" Still nothing. Just that stare. A deep sense of wrongness crept into Daniel's chest, but he ignored it. It was just a dog. Maybe it had a strange personality, but that didn't mean anything was wrong. "I should take you outside," he said, dropping his hand and stepping back. "You probably need some fresh air." As soon as he said it, Shadow stood up. Not in a normal, relaxed way. Its movements were too precise, too intentional, as if it had been waiting for permission. Daniel hesitated, then led the way to the front door. He unlocked it, pulled it open, and stepped onto the porch. The morning air was crisp, the neighborhood quiet. It was early, but usually there were a few people out walking their dogs or jogging. Not today. Everything felt still. Daniel glanced back at Shadow, who was standing just inside the doorway, staring out. "Go ahead," he urged, motioning toward the yard. But Shadow didn't move. Daniel frowned. "You don't want to go out." The dog's ears twitched slightly, but it remained where it was, as if something was keeping it from stepping outside. Daniel's pulse quickened. "Okay," he murmured, stepping back inside and shutting the door. The second the lock clicked, Shadow turned and walked away, disappearing down the hall. Daniel exhaled slowly. Something was wrong. He had tried to ignore it, tried to brush off the strange feeling, but it was getting harder. The way Shadow moved, the way it watched him, it wasn't normal. And now, the way it refused to go outside. Daniel grabbed his phone and opened a search engine. His fingers hovered over the screen. What was he even looking for? Signs your dog is sick. Weird dog behavior. Why won't my dog go outside? None of it seemed right. He hesitated, then typed. Dog staring at owner all night meaning. The results popped up immediately. Some were harmless. Articles about how dogs stare to bond to show affection. But others. Superstition says dogs can see things humans can't. In some cultures, an animal that refuses to go outside is a sign that something unnatural is inside the home. Dogs that watch their owners without blinking may be warning them of danger. Or waiting for something. Daniel's throat went dry. He locked his phone and set it down. This was ridiculous. He wasn't the kind of person who believed in superstitions. But then why was his stomach twisting into knots? He glanced toward the hallway. The house was silent again. For the first time since bringing Shadow home, Daniel wondered if he had made a mistake. That night things got worse. Daniel tried to ignore the unease as he went about his evening. He made dinner, watched TV, scrolled on his phone. All the usual distractions. Shadow stayed in the living room, silent as always, watching. By the time he was ready for bed, exhaustion weighed down his body. But as he climbed under the covers, he kept the lamp on. He wasn't sure why. Maybe he just didn't want to be in the dark. His eyelids grew heavy, his breathing slowed. Sleep was pulling him under. And then, sound. Soft whisper. Daniel's eyes snapped open. His pulse slammed against his ribs. The room was silent. But he knew what he had heard. Voice. A whisper. Coming from the foot of his bed. His breath hitched. Slowly, so slowly, he turned his head. Shadow was there. Sitting. Watching. Daniel's chest tightened. His mind screamed at him to move, to get up, to do something. But he couldn't. The whisper came again. Low. Almost distant. Daniel's entire body went cold. His heart pounded so loudly he thought it might burst. Shadow didn't move. Didn't blink. Then finally, after what felt like forever, Daniel found his voice. "Who are you?" he whispered. The air in the room shifted. A pressure settled over his chest. The whisper stopped. And then, for the first time since he had brought the dog home, Shadow moved. It tilted its head just slightly. And then, it smiled. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His body tensed, every muscle frozen in place. Dogs don't smile. Not like that. It wasn't a friendly expression, wasn't the kind of happy, tongue-lolling grin a dog gives when it's excited. No, this was something else. Something unnatural. The corners of Shadow's mouth lifted just slightly, revealing the faintest hint of teeth. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something, but fear had him locked in place. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the expression vanished. Shadow was normal again, silent, still watching. Daniel shot up in bed. His breath coming in short gasps. His body was shaking. He had to get a grip. He had to remind himself this was just a dog. He was probably sleep-deprived, seeing things that weren't really there. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Slowly, he reached for his phone on the nightstand, never taking his eyes off Shadow. His fingers fumbled as he turned on the flashlight. The bright beam cut through the darkness, landing on the dog's face. Those golden eyes stared back at him, dull and empty. Daniel's throat tightened. He needed air. He needed to get out of this room. Without thinking, he swung his legs over the bed and stood up. Shadow's head tilted ever so slightly, following his movement. Daniel backed toward the door. His breath felt too loud in the silence. His hand found the doorknob, gripping it tightly. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "Stay here," he whispered. His voice was hoarse. He didn't know why he said it. Shadow never followed him unless he called. But something about saying the words made him feel like he had some control over the situation. He turned the knob and stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder out here, heavier. The house was dark, except for the faint glow from the streetlights filtering through the windows. He needed to clear his head. Maybe step outside for a minute. Daniel reached for the front door, unlocking it with shaky fingers. He pulled it open, letting in the crisp night air. The moment the door swung wide, something shifted behind him. Sound. Barely audible. Pause on the floor. Daniel turned his head just enough to see. Shadow was standing in the hallway, just outside his bedroom. Watching. The dog hadn't made a sound when it moved. It was just there. Daniel's pulse spiked. He swallowed hard and forced himself to breathe. Shadow, he murmured, barely recognizing his own voice. What do you want? The dog didn't respond. Didn't move. But something was different. For the first time, Shadow wasn't staring at him. It was staring past him. Daniel's stomach twisted. Slowly, so slowly, he turned his head and looked outside. The street was empty. The houses were dark. Nothing seemed out of place. But the air felt wrong. It was too still. Too quiet. His porch light flickered once. Just for a second. Then, from the shadows beyond the street, something moved. Daniel's breath caught. He couldn't see it clearly. Just a shift in the darkness, something tall, something watching. His skin prickled with cold. His instinct screamed at him to slam the door. But before he could, Shadow let out a sound. A low guttural growl. Daniel froze. It wasn't a warning growl. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Something almost expectant. Daniel's heart pounded against his ribs. He had to close the door. He had to shut whatever this was out. But before he could move, Shadow did something that sent ice through his veins. The dog took a step forward. Not toward Daniel. Toward the open door. Toward whatever was waiting outside. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears as he watched Shadow take another step toward the open door. His body screamed at him to move, to slam it shut, to put a barrier between himself and whatever was out there. But his limbs felt locked in place, frozen by something deeper than fear. Shadow's growl deepened, the low rumble vibrating through the floor. The air outside remained eerily still, yet Daniel could feel the weight of something unseen pressing against the space between the doorway and the street. And then it moved again. Not Shadow. The thing outside. It wasn't just a flicker in the darkness this time. It was real, shifting closer, its shape still undefined, but undeniably there. Figure tall and wrong. Too thin. Too still. Daniel's fingers twitched at his side. He had to shut the door. Before he could act, Shadow did something he hadn't expected. The dog turned its head slightly, just enough to glance at him. And for the first time since he had brought Shadow home, its expression changed. Not the unsettling smile from before. Something else. It almost looked expectant. Like it was waiting for Daniel to make a choice. The moment stretched too long. Then, without warning, the porch light flickered again, this time staying off. Darkness swallowed everything. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. In the pitch-black silence, the air around him thickened. He could feel something in the doorway, just beyond the threshold. Closer now. And then, a whisper. Almost playful. Not from outside. From Shadow. Daniel didn't hear words exactly. Just the faintest sound, like a breath forming a thought too quiet to grasp. But it sent a shiver down his spine. His skin crawling with a cold that had nothing to do with the night air. His body finally obeyed him. He moved fast, slamming the door shut with a force that rattled the frame. His hands fumbled with the lock, twisting it tight. Silence. He stepped back, his breath coming in sharp gasps. His pulse hammered as he turned to look at Shadow, expecting what? An answer. A reaction. But the dog was already sitting. Watching. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. His fingers shaking. He needed to think. He needed to figure out what was happening. And then his phone vibrated. The sudden noise made him jump. His hands scrambled for the device in his pocket. His breath catching as he glanced at the screen. A number he didn't recognize. His stomach twisted. Every instinct told him not to answer. But his thumb moved on its own, swiping across the screen. He lifted the phone to his ear. Hello. His voice was barely above a whisper. For a moment there was nothing. Just silence. Static. A crackling, broken sound like a voice trying to push through interference. Then faintly he heard it. "Don't let it in." Daniel's blood ran cold. The call ended. His screen went dark. His hands trembled as he lowered the phone. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what just happened. Who was that? How did they know? And what exactly had he almost let in? He turned back to Shadow, his breath unsteady. The dog hadn't moved. It was still staring at him, golden eyes unblinking. Daniel felt it then. A shift in the air. A realization. The presence outside hadn't left. And worse, it wasn't alone anymore. Daniel's breath came in short, uneven gasps. The house felt smaller now, as if the walls were pressing in, as if the space itself had changed. He could still feel whatever was outside waiting, watching. But now there was something worse. The undeniable feeling that it wasn't just outside anymore. His phone was still clenched in his shaking hand, the call's final words echoing in his mind. "Don't let it in." But it was already too late. Shadow hadn't moved, still sitting in the same spot, staring. But the air around the dog felt different now. He could feel it, like a low hum vibrating through the floor. Daniel took a step back. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to listen. Every instinct told him that whatever had been outside wasn't separate from Shadow at all. They were connected. Shadow stood. Slowly, deliberately. Daniel's chest tightened. The dog's golden eyes locked onto his, unblinking, unwavering. And then, just for a moment, something changed. His eyes. They weren't golden anymore. They were black. Deep, endless black, as if they weren't eyes at all but voids where something else looked out. Daniel's entire body went cold. The pressure in the air grew heavier, pressing against his ribs, making it hard to breathe. And then Shadow took a step toward him. Daniel staggered back, his foot catching against the edge of the rug. He barely kept himself from falling, his pulse pounding so loudly he could barely hear his own thoughts. Sound. Not from Shadow. From behind him. Daniel froze. Every nerve in his body screamed at him not to turn around. But he had no choice. Slowly, shakily, he turned his head. The front door. The lock was turning. On its own. Click. The handle twisted, creaking as it moved. Daniel's breath hitched. His mind screamed, "It's coming in." He had to stop it. He had to. But before he could move, Shadow did. With unnatural speed, the dog lunged. Not at him. The door. A deep, guttural snarl ripped through the air as Shadow's body crashed into the wood with enough force to shake the frame. The entire house seemed to tremble with the impact. The lock stopped turning. The handle went still. Silence. Daniel's chest heaved. His body frozen in shock as Shadow stood in front of the door, every muscle tensed for bristling. The dog was still, ears pricked, waiting. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the presence outside shifted. It didn't leave. Not entirely. But it pulled back, retreating into the darkness beyond the porch. The pressure in the air lifted. The house felt like a house again. Shadow stood there for a long moment before finally turning to look at Daniel. The dog's golden eyes were back. Normal. Like nothing had happened. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. His mind raced to piece everything together, to make sense of what had just happened. And then it hit him. Shadow hadn't been the thing he needed to fear. Shadow had been protecting him. The whispers, the watching, the strange movements. It hadn't been malice. Had been warning. Waiting. Guarding. Daniel's breath came out shaky. He ran a hand over his face, his entire body still trembling. He didn't know what had been outside. He didn't know why Shadow had been the only one keeping it from getting in. But he knew one thing for sure. Everyone had told him not to adopt this dog. And now, more than ever, he was glad he hadn't listened. Because without Shadow, he might not have been there to tell the story at all. Daniel stood in the middle of his living room, his breath still uneven, his body still processing what had just happened. The air had settled, the strange, suffocating pressure was gone, but the weight of the moment lingered. Shadow stood by the door, unmoving, ears perked, as if still listening for something only he could hear. Daniel swallowed hard. His hands were shaking. He looked at the door, at the lock that had almost turned, and a chill ran down his spine. He didn't know what had been out there, but he knew it had wanted in. And if Shadow hadn't been here, if he had ignored all the signs, he didn't want to think about what might have happened. His gaze drifted back to the dog. Shadow's golden eyes met his, steady, unblinking. There was no fear in them. No uncertainty. Just calm. Daniel took a slow step forward, then another. He crouched down, hesitating for only a moment before reaching out and running a hand over Shadow's thick fur. The dog didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, for the first time since Daniel had brought him home, Shadow leaned into his touch. A lump formed in Daniel's throat. He hadn't known what to expect when he adopted Shadow. He had been warned over and over that something was wrong with this dog, that he was dangerous, that people had tried before and failed. But now, after everything, Daniel understood. Shadow wasn't the threat. Shadow had been keeping the threat away. The pieces of the story slowly fell into place in his mind. Maybe the other people who had adopted him before didn't understand. Maybe they ignored the signs. Maybe they let their fear convince them that Shadow was the problem when, in reality, he had been trying to protect them. And maybe that was why they didn't last. Daniel let out a shaky breath. He didn't know what it meant that Shadow had chosen to protect him tonight. He didn't know if whatever had been outside would come back. But one thing was certain. Shadow wasn't going anywhere. Daniel gave the dog one last pat before standing up. His entire body ached with exhaustion, but he knew sleep wasn't an option. Not tonight. Not after this. He walked over to the front door, checking the lock again even though he knew it was secure. The night outside was silent still. But he no longer trusted the quiet. Turning back to Shadow, Daniel muttered, "I guess I owe you one." His voice was hoarse, but the dog's ears perked slightly like he understood. A faint, tired smile tugged at the corner of Daniel's lips. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into when he brought Shadow home, but one thing was clear now. This wasn't just a dog. This was something more. The warning had been wrong. Everyone had told him not to adopt this dog. But they had been wrong. Because Shadow wasn't just his pet. He was his protector. And Daniel had a feeling he always would be.